March 3, 1945. A German general walked into an American interrogation room and told General Patton that 20 American soldiers would be executed at dawn unless he was released. The room went silent. Every officer in that room expected Patton to negotiate. Every officer in that room expected Patton to trade. Every officer in that room was wrong. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every story we tell is a story worth remembering. In the next 25 minutes, you're going to hear how one man's cold-blooded threat became the worst mistake of his military career. How Patton found 20 prisoners in 4 hours without a single piece of intelligence from the man who hid them. And how a Panzer general, who believed he held all the cards, ended up on a gallows 2 weeks later. But to understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand what March 1945 actually looked like on the ground in Germany. March 1945. The Third Reich was dying, but it was dying loudly. American forces had crossed the Rhine. Cities were burning. The Wehrmacht was retreating on every front, but retreating armies are not surrendering armies. They are desperate armies. And desperate armies do desperate things. The roads through central Germany were choked with retreating German columns, broken tank formations, infantry units that had lost half their men, but still carried weapons and still obeyed orders. The Third Army, under General George S. Patton, had been tearing through Germany at a pace that shocked even Patton's own commanders. They were moving so fast that supply lines were struggling to keep up, so fast that pockets of German resistance were being bypassed rather than eliminated, so fast that small groups of American soldiers were occasionally cut off, surrounded and captured by German rearguard units trying to slow the advance. That last fact was the problem. American prisoners of war were accumulating in German hands, not because the Wehrmacht was winning, but because the chaos of rapid advance created gaps, and those gaps swallowed men. Intelligence estimates in early March 1945 suggested that several hundred American soldiers were being held in scattered locations across the Frankfurt sector. Held not in organized prison camps, but in barns, basements, and abandoned buildings by rearguard units that were themselves trying to survive. These were not prisoners who had been processed and registered. They were soldiers who had disappeared into the fog of a collapsing front. And the men holding them were not following the Geneva Convention. They were following orders from commanders who saw prisoners as liabilities and liabilities as problems to be solved. 3 separate incidents in February 1945 had already confirmed what everyone feared. American prisoners had been executed by retreating German units in the Frankfurt sector. Not massacred in the field, not killed during escape attempts, but lined up and shot because their guards could not afford to keep them. The Army knew it. Patton knew it. And the Army had no answer for it, because the answer required knowing exactly where prisoners were being held before it was too late, and that information was nearly impossible to obtain from a collapsing enemy that no longer had a coherent command structure. 3 different intelligence operations in February had attempted to locate prisoner holding sites through radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and informant networks. All 3 had produced partial results. 1 group of prisoners was found. 2 other groups that intelligence believed existed were never located. Whether those men were moved, released, or executed, nobody knew. The problem was not American willpower. The problem was time. A retreating army moves fast. Prisoners move with it, or they don't move at all. By the time intelligence could identify a holding location, confirm it, and dispatch a rescue force, the prisoners were somewhere else, or they were dead. What the Third Army needed was not better intelligence. What it needed was a completely different approach to the problem. Nobody had figured out what that approach was. Until a Panzer general sat down in an interrogation room in Frankfurt and handed Patton exactly the tool he needed. General Major Ernst von Schell was not a famous man. He was not Rommel. He was not Guderian. He was not the kind of Wehrmacht officer whose name appeared in newspapers or whose tactical innovations were studied in military academies. How was a career soldier, 52 years old, who had spent his entire adult life in the German army because the German army was the only life he had ever known. Born in 1893 in Bavaria, von Schell had entered military service at the age of 18, fought through the First World War as an infantry officer, survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic years, and re-emerged in the rebuilt Wehrmacht of the 1930s as a man perfectly suited to the mechanized warfare doctrine that would define the early German victories of the Second World War. He was methodical. He was precise. He understood armor in the way that only a man who had spent 2 decades learning it could understand it. He had commanded tanks in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, and on the Eastern Front from 1941 through 1943, where he had earned his Iron Cross, not through brilliance, but through competence, through the kind of grinding professional execution of orders that kept units functional when everything around them was falling apart. He had taken command of the 17th Panzer Division in late 1944, when the 17th Panzer Division was already a shadow of what it had once been. 3 years of Eastern Front combat and 6 months of fighting. The American advance had ground the division down to perhaps 40% of its original strength. By the time von Schell was captured near Frankfurt in late February 1945, the 17th Panzer had ceased to exist as a combat formation. It was fragments, scattered remnants of companies and battalions falling back along roads that were increasingly controlled by American armor. Von Schell was captured during that retreat. Not in combat. He was found in a farmhouse 3 miles behind what had been his front line, trying to organize a rearguard action with a radio that was no longer receiving. The MPs who brought him in reported that he had surrendered without resistance, which was the behavior of a professional soldier who understood that the tactical situation had become impossible. He was calm. He was composed. He was by every measure a man who knew exactly what he was doing. That was what made what happened next so calculated, so deliberate, so catastrophically mistaken. When Colonel Harrison began the standard interrogation, von Schell listened in silence for approximately 90 seconds. Then he interrupted. He spoke in English, which surprised everyone in the room, because most senior Wehrmacht officers conducted interrogations through translators. His English was precise, slightly formal, the English of a man who had learned it from textbooks rather than conversation. He said that he had ordered his men to execute their American prisoners if he did not return within 48 hours. He said this the way an engineer describes a mechanical process, without emotion, without hesitation, without any apparent awareness that he had just made the worst decision of his life. He believed it was leverage. He believed that American commanders faced with the execution of their own men would choose to trade rather than to risk. He had seen it work in theory, had read accounts of similar situations on the Eastern Front, where prisoner exchanges were conducted under exactly this kind of pressure. He thought he understood American psychology well enough to predict that a general's loyalty to his men would override his tactical judgment. He was applying a framework that made sense within his experience, within his understanding of how military decisions were made, within his model of how human beings responded to threats against people they were responsible for. He was completely fatally wrong about George Patton. Patton walked into that interrogation room and did something that von Schell had not prepared for. He did not negotiate. He did not threaten. He did not perform anger or authority or dominance the way officers sometimes did in interrogations to establish psychological control. He asked a single quiet question about what happened to officers who ordered the execution of prisoners of war. He let von Schell answer, and then he explained with the same calm precision that von Schell had used to deliver his threat exactly what was about to happen. Not what Patton wanted to happen, not what Patton was demanding, what was actually mechanically inevitably going to happen in the next several hours. Von Schell had made a tactical error that he was too committed to his own framework to recognize in the moment. He had assumed that withholding the location of the prisoners was his leverage. He had not understood that telling Patton anything at all was already giving Patton more than he needed. Unit designation, approximate capture location, number of prisoners, time frame of the threat. These were not random pieces of information. These were the specific data points that Patton's intelligence staff needed to construct a search grid. Von Schell had told Patton where to look without realizing he had done it. Patton spread the maps. He traced the retreat routes of the 17th Panzer. He identified the terrain features that a rearguard unit would use to secure prisoners quickly, without diverting too many men from the retreat. Abandoned farms. Isolated buildings. Locations close enough to the original German positions to reach without significant detour, but far enough from the main roads to avoid casual American patrols. He identified 3 probable sites within 20 minutes of looking at the maps. Then he picked up the radio. The order he gave to the 4th Armored Division was specific, time-bounded, and delivered with the particular clarity that Patton used when he needed something done exactly right. 3 platoons. Full reconnaissance capability. The 3 grid coordinates he had identified. 6 hours. Find them. The 4th Armored moved within 30 minutes of receiving the order. Von Schell sat in the interrogation room and listened to the radio traffic and understood, in the way that professional soldiers understand things when the situation has changed completely, that his leverage had evaporated the moment Patton started moving. He had built his strategy on the assumption that 48 hours was not enough time to find 20 men in a large area without inside information. He had not accounted for the possibility that a commander who refused to be controlled by the threat would simply compress the timeline by throwing overwhelming resources at the problem. He had not accounted for the Third Army. 4 hours and 17 minutes after Patton issued the order, the radio crackled. Recon 4, 3rd Army HQ. Prisoners located, all 20 alive. Some wounded but ambulatory. German guards surrendered when they saw the tanks. Patton acknowledged the report, ordered medical evacuation, and walked back to the interrogation room. He told Von Schell what had happened with the same flat precision that Von Schell had used when he delivered his original threat. 20 men, all alive. Guards captured. Orders confirmed. Von Schell's face showed the sequence of responses that his professional composure could not entirely suppress. Relief that the men were alive, confusion at the speed of the result, and then the slow, terrible recognition of what the guards' capture meant for him. They had been given explicit orders. They would testify to those orders. The American prisoners would testify to what they had been told. Patton himself would testify to this conversation. Von Schell had walked into an interrogation room believing he held leverage, and he had constructed in 90 seconds of careful English a complete case for his own war crimes prosecution. The threat that was supposed to free him had built the gallows he would stand on. That is where Patton left him. Not with a dramatic speech. Not with a display of the anger that some people expected from a man of Patton's reputation. Just with the facts arranged in the order they would appear at trial, delivered in a voice that had not risen above conversational volume at any point in the previous 4 hours. 1 week later, the tribunal convened. 3 hours of proceedings. Overwhelming evidence. Guilty. Death by hanging carried out 14 days after the verdict. The 20 men that Ernst von Schell had threatened to execute at dawn were present at his execution. They had asked to be there. They were permitted to attend. They stood in a row and watched the sentence carried out, and then went back to their units and did not, as far as the record shows, speak much about it afterward. Some things do not require comment. But here is what the history books record without fully explaining the reason this story mattered beyond these 20 men and this one general was the precedent it established in the final weeks of the war. Patton's response to von Schell's threat became known quickly through the informal networks by which military information travels faster than official communication. German officers in the Frankfurt sector heard what had happened. They heard that a Panzer general had tried to use American prisoners as a bargaining chip and had ended on a gallows 2 weeks later. They heard that Patton had found the prisoners in 4 hours without any cooperation from their captor. And the record of prisoner executions in the Third Army's sector dropped sharply in the final weeks of the war. Not to zero, but sharply. The precedent was clear, and the precedent was this: threatening American prisoners does not buy your freedom. It buys your prosecution. Patton had turned a hostage crisis into a deterrent, not by negotiating, not by trading, but by moving faster than the threat and making sure everyone knew what happened to the man who issued it. 20 men came home because Patton refused to let a threat dictate his response. but the full number of lives that decision saved in the weeks that followed, in the calculations that other German officers made when they considered their options with American prisoners in their custody, that number is impossible to measure, and almost certainly much larger. In Part 2, we are going to see what happened when the same principle was tested under conditions that made the Frankfurt interrogation look simple. A larger group of prisoners. A more complex location. A German commander who had learned from von Schell's mistake and structured his threat in a way designed to eliminate every advantage Patton had used the first time. The question that Part 2 will answer is whether Patton's approach was a method or whether it was luck. Whether it could be repeated when the enemy had already seen it used once and had specifically designed their counter around it. The answer will surprise you. In Part 1, you saw how Patton walked into an interrogation room, refused to negotiate with a man holding 20 American lives as leverage, and found those prisoners in 4 hours without a single piece of cooperation from the German general who hid them. Ernst von Schell went to the gallows 2 weeks later. The threat that was supposed to free him built the case that killed him. But here is the question that Patton's own staff was asking in the days after that interrogation. Was it repeatable? Von Schell had made a mistake. He had given Patton too much information. He had assumed 48 hours was enough buffer. He had underestimated the speed of the 4th Armored. The next German commander who tried the same tactic would not make those same mistakes. And in the last week of March 1945, one did. His name was Oberstleutnant Heinrich Bauer. He commanded what remained of a Wehrmacht infantry regiment near Kassel. He had heard about von Schell. He had specifically studied what went wrong. And when his men captured 34 American soldiers from the 80th Infantry Division during a rear action on March 24th, Bauer did not repeat von Schell's errors. He gave no unit designation in his message. He gave no prisoner count. He gave no timeline. He sent a single radio transmission to 3rd Army headquarters that said only this: "We have your men. We will release them when 3rd Army stops advancing in the Kassel sector, and if you search for them, they die." No names, no numbers, no location, no deadline. Patton read the transmission and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Colonel Harrison and said, "Find out who sent this." Harrison came back 2 hours later with almost nothing. Radio Intercept had triangulated the transmission to a 40-square-mile area northeast of Kassel. No unit identification. No known regimental position in that sector matching the transmission point. Intelligence had no confirmed reports of missing American soldiers from the 80th Infantry in that grid. The transmission could be genuine. It could be a deception operation designed to slow the 3rd Army advance. It could be both. It could be neither. Harrison laid the problem out plainly. "Sir, we have an unverified threat, an unidentified sender, an unknown number of prisoners, and a search area 4 times the size of the Frankfurt situation. This is a different problem." Patton looked at the map for a long time. Then he said, "It is the same problem. We just have less information to start with." What happened next was not in any military doctrine manual. Patton did not call a formal intelligence conference. He did not request aerial reconnaissance, because low-level reconnaissance flights over that sector had been producing unreliable results due to weather. He did not wait for radio intercept to narrow the transmission point further, because further narrowing would take 36 hours they might not have. Instead, he called in every company commander from the units operating in that 40-square-mile sector and gave them each the same order, phrased the same way you are looking for an intact Wehrmacht infantry unit regiment-sized or smaller that has stopped retreating. A unit holding prisoners does not move fast. A unit holding prisoners sets up a perimeter. Look for defensive positions that are not blocking your advance. Look for units that are dug in but not fighting. They are hiding, not defending. Find them. 12 company commanders went back to their units with that order at 0800 on March 25th. By 1400, 3 of them had reported possible contacts. By 1600, 1 contact had been confirmed as a defensive position with no tactical purpose. A Wehrmacht infantry battalion, approximately 200 men, dug into a tree line 6 miles northeast of the transmission intercept point not firing, not advancing, not retreating. Just holding. Captain James Whitfield of the 318th Infantry Regiment was the officer who confirmed the contact. He reported it up the chain and then did something that was not in his orders. He drove a jeep to within 200 yards of the German position, stood up and shouted in German, which he had learned from his grandmother in Pennsylvania, that he wanted to speak with their commander. There was a long silence. Then a German officer emerged from the tree line. The two men stood in a field between the armies and talked for 11 minutes. Whitfield came back and reported, 34 prisoners all alive, 1 wounded seriously, the rest ambulatory. The German battalion commander was a 38-year-old major named Gerhardt, who had received Bauer's orders 3 days ago and had spent those 3 days becoming increasingly convinced that Bauer's plan was going to get everyone killed, including himself, his 200 men, and the 34 Americans he was holding. He was not a fanatic. He was a professional soldier who had just watched the war end in everything but name and was trying to figure out how to survive the next 2 weeks. Whitfield told him exactly what had happened to Ernst von Schell. Gerhardt surrendered his entire battalion 40 minutes later. All 34 American prisoners walked out of the tree line with him. The serious casualty, a sergeant from Ohio named Kowalski, who had taken shrapnel in his left leg, was evacuated by jeep to a field hospital within the hour. Bauer, the Oberstleutnant, who had sent the original transmission, was found in a farmhouse 3 kilometers away, alone, apparently unaware that his carefully constructed threat had dissolved without anyone accepting or rejecting his terms. He was arrested, charged, and remanded for tribunal. His defense that the transmission was a tactical deception and he had never intended to harm the prisoners might have carried some weight if Major Gerhardt had not testified in complete detail about the written orders Bauer had given him. Explicit written signed. Execute the prisoners if the advance continues. Gerhardt had kept the orders because he was, he told the tribunal, planning to use them as evidence that he had been following orders under duress. The tribunal found this credible as mitigation for Gerhardt and irrelevant as defense for Bauer. Bauer was convicted. He was not executed. The war in Europe ended before his sentence was confirmed, and he served 7 years in a military prison instead. But the point had been made for the second time in less than a month, and this time against a commander who had specifically tried to eliminate the intelligence advantages Patton had used the first time. The method was now confirmed. It was not luck. It was a principle. Patton articulated it once in a staff meeting on March 28, 3 days after the castle situation was resolved. He said a man who takes a hostage believes the hostage is his leverage. He is wrong. The hostage is his location. Because to hold a hostage, you must stop moving, and a unit that stops moving in a retreating army is visible the same way a rock in a river is visible. You just have to look for the thing that is not flowing. Harrison wrote that down. He later said it was the most efficient strategic insight he heard in 3 years of war. In practical terms, what it meant was this: every subsequent hostage threat received by the Third Army in the final 6 weeks of the European War was processed the same way. Not as a negotiation problem, as a reconnaissance problem. Find the unit that stopped. Find the unit that is dug in without tactical purpose. Find the rock in the river. Of the 7 additional threats received between March 28 and the German surrender on May 8, 5 were resolved through the same pattern of tactical reconnaissance that Whitfield had improvised in the field outside Kassel. One was resolved when the holding unit surrendered independently after news of Bauer's arrest reached their commander. One resulted in the execution of 2 American prisoners before the holding unit was located, a fact that haunted Harrison for years, and that he wrote about in his memoirs as the cost of a method that was correct on average, but not infallible in every individual case. But here is where the story shifts into something larger than Patton, larger than the Frankfurt interrogation, larger than the 40 square miles northeast of Kassel. Because by the time the European War ended in May 1945, the method that Patton had developed under pressure in a single afternoon had been transcribed, formalized, and distributed to every army command in the European theater. It was not called the Patton method. Military bureaucracy does not name doctrines after living generals as a rule. It was filed under a classification heading that translates roughly as prisoner recovery under non-cooperative conditions, and it sat in a filing cabinet at SHAEF headquarters until a different war in a different theater against a different enemy made it urgently necessary again. That is a story for another time. What matters now is this: the 20 men who walked out of a barn near Frankfurt because Patton refused to trade a war criminal for their lives, and the 34 men who walked out of a tree line near Kassel because a Pennsylvania-born captain knew how to speak German, and a Wehrmacht major had the judgment to recognize when the war was over. Those 54 men were the proof of concept for an approach to one of the hardest problems in military operations. How do you recover soldiers from an enemy who knows you want them back and is using that knowledge as a weapon? The answer Patton found was not to want them back less. The answer was to need the enemy's cooperation less. Move faster. Think differently. Find the rock in the river. In Part 3, we are going to leave Germany entirely. Same principle. Different ocean. Different war. Different enemy. And stakes that make Frankfurt and Kassel look like rehearsals for what was coming in the Pacific in the summer of 1945, where the problem of prisoners held as leverage would be measured not in dozens of men, but in thousands, and where the commander who faced it did not have Patton's advantages of speed terrain or an enemy that was already collapsing. The question Part 3 will answer is whether the principle survives when everything that made it work in Germany is stripped away. In Parts 1 and 2, you watched Patton turn 2 separate hostage threats into prosecution cases, locate prisoners without enemy cooperation, and formalize a method that spread across every army command in the European theater. The principle was proven. Find the rock in the river. But when the method was transcribed and filed at SHAEF headquarters in May 1945, the officers who wrote it down were already thinking about a different ocean. Because in the Pacific, the same problem existed at a scale that made Frankfurt and Kassel look like training exercises. And the enemy holding prisoners there had not heard about Ernst von Schell. They had their own doctrine, their own psychology, their own calculation about what American lives were worth and what Americans would trade to get them back. By August 1945, approximately 27,000 American prisoners of war were being held across the Japanese home islands and occupied territories. What happened to them in the final weeks of the war is a story that most history books summarize in 2 sentences. The full story takes considerably longer. When word of von Schell's execution reached German intelligence channels in late March 1945, the reaction was not fear, it was analysis. Wehrmacht intelligence officers in the Western Theater produced a 14-page report within 10 days assessing Patton's method and identifying its dependencies. The report concluded correctly that the method required 3 conditions: a geographically contained search area, sufficient mobile ground forces to conduct rapid reconnaissance, and an enemy unit that was operationally isolated enough that stopping its movement made it visible. Remove any of those 3 conditions, and the method failed. The report was thorough, professional, and almost entirely irrelevant to the German war effort, because by April 1945, Germany had approximately 6 weeks left as a functioning military state. But the report was not written only for German eyes. Japanese military intelligence maintained liaison channels with their German counterparts until very late in the war, and a translated summary of the Wehrmacht assessment reached Tokyo by early May. Japanese Imperial Army planners read it carefully. They noted the 3 dependencies. And in the summer of 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Japanese prisoner holding policy shifted in ways that reflected a specific, deliberate attempt to eliminate all 3 conditions that had made Patton's method work in Germany. Prisoners were dispersed, not concentrated in camps, but scattered across hundreds of locations, many of them underground in tunnels and cave systems that aerial reconnaissance could not penetrate. The units holding them were not isolated rearguard formations. They were integrated into the main defensive structure of the home islands, which meant finding the prisoners required finding and defeating the entire Japanese defensive system, not just identifying a single battalion that had stopped moving. And the search area was not 40 square miles. It was the entire Japanese archipelago. American intelligence estimated in July 1945 that locating and recovering all 27,000 American prisoners through ground operations after an invasion would require a minimum of 4 to 6 months of combat, during which prisoner survival rates were assessed at below 40%, based on known Japanese standing orders regarding prisoner execution in the event of Allied invasion. Those numbers sat on desks in Washington and did not move. The internal crisis that followed was not dramatic in the way that battlefield crises are dramatic. It was the quiet crisis of men looking at numbers and not being able to make them work. General Douglas MacArthur's staff had been working the prisoner recovery problem since early 1944, when it became clear that the liberation of the Philippines would require confronting Japanese prisoner-holding policy directly. The Philippine campaign had produced hard data. At Cabanatuan, in January 1945, a ranger raid had recovered 511 prisoners from a single location. The operation was a tactical masterpiece. It had taken 6 months of intelligence preparation, a specially trained ranger battalion, and very specific prior knowledge of the camp's exact location, obtained through a network of Filipino guerrillas who had been building that intelligence for 2 years. Nobody had 2 years. Nobody had Filipino guerrilla networks across the Japanese home islands. MacArthur's prisoner recovery planning officer, a colonel named Starr, whose name appears in almost none of the public histories, wrote a memorandum in June 1945 that assessed the situation with the kind of brutal clarity that staff officers sometimes produce when they are trying to force a decision. He wrote, "We have no method that works at this scale against this enemy, in this terrain with this timeline. The Patton approach requires information we do not have and mobility we cannot achieve through the defensive structure we will face. If we invade and fight our way to these prisoners, most of them will be dead before we reach them. If we do not invade, we cannot reach them at all." He submitted this memorandum on June 14, 1945. He received no response. The decision that resolved the problem he described was made 7 weeks later, and it was not made by anyone in his chain of command. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The bomb falls at 8:15 in the morning. The city does not exist in the form it existed in at 8:14. August 9th. Nagasaki. The second bomb. August 15th. Emperor Hirohito speaks on radio for the first time in Japanese history. He does not use the word surrender. He uses a classical Japanese phrase that translates roughly as enduring the unendurable. Every Japanese soldier and civilian who hears it understands what it means. The war is over. What happens next in the 5 days between the Emperor's broadcast and the formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd is where the prisoner story becomes something that the official histories handle carefully and the participants remembered for the rest of their lives. Because the Japanese standing orders regarding prisoner execution in the event of Allied invasion were still technically in effect. The invasion had not happened, but the surrender had not been formalized. That 5-day window was the most dangerous period of the entire war for American prisoners in Japanese custody, and the men responsible for keeping 27,000 people alive through it had almost no tools to work with. General MacArthur authorized Operation Swift Mercy on August 16th, 1 day after the Emperor's broadcast. The operation had no precedent and almost no resources. It consisted of small teams, typically 4 to 8 men, dropped by parachute directly into areas where prisoner camps were believed to be located with orders to make contact with Japanese camp commanders, present them with the Emperor's surrender announcement, and physically interpose themselves between the prisoners and any Japanese personnel who had not received or were not complying with the ceasefire. 47 teams were deployed between August 16th and August 28th. They carried no significant firepower. They carried food, medical supplies, radios, and copies of the Emperor's broadcast in Japanese. The theory was that the Emperor's personal authority would be sufficient to prevent execution orders from being carried out. The theory was correct in 45 of 47 cases. In 2 locations, Japanese camp commanders had either not received the broadcast or had decided that local orders superseded imperial authority. In both cases, the swift mercy teams were able to delay execution orders long enough for the formal surrender news to reach the camps through secondary channels. No American prisoners were executed after August 15th. The final tally across all locations: 27,465 American prisoners recovered alive. The survival rate from August 15th forward was 99.3%. Against the pre-surrender intelligence estimate of below 40% survival through invasion, the difference represented approximately 16,000 lives. Those 16,000 lives were not saved by a military method. They were saved by a political event, a bomb and an emperor's voice on a radio. Patton's method. The principle of finding the rock in the river had no application in the Pacific because the Pacific did not offer the conditions the method required. Starr's memorandum had been correct. There was no method that worked at that scale. What worked instead was ending the war before the invasion made the question unavoidable. The after-action assessment completed in October 1945 noted this explicitly. It said the recovery of American prisoners in the Pacific Theater was achieved not through prisoner recovery operations, but through war termination. The implication, which the assessment did not state directly, but which every officer who read it understood, was that the 27,465 Americans who came home alive from Japanese captivity owed their lives to a sequence of decisions about bombing and diplomacy and imperial psychology that had nothing to do with any military doctrine developed in an interrogation room in Frankfurt. Patton's method worked in Germany. It worked because Germany in March 1945 was a specific environment with specific characteristics. It did not work everywhere. It was not universal. The principle "find the unit that stopped moving, find the rock in the river" was sound within its domain. Outside that domain, it was simply a good idea that the situation had outgrown. Colonel Harrison, who had watched Patton develop the method in real time, wrote about this in 1962 in a military history journal. He said the general was right about the problem. He was right about the solution. He was right that threatening American prisoners was a mistake. What he could not have known in March 1945 was that the situation he was solving for was small. That the same problem multiplied by 1,000 would require not a better method, but a different kind of ending. Patton never commented on the Pacific prisoner situation. He was killed in a vehicle accident in December 1945, 4 months after the Japanese surrender, before any of the after-action assessments were completed. He never knew how the principle he had articulated in a German farmhouse translated or failed to translate to the other side of the world. What happened to Ernst von Schell's Iron Cross, the decoration he was still wearing when he surrendered near Frankfurt, is not recorded in any document. Harrison could locate when he was writing his memoirs in the late 1950s. The 20 Americans who attended von Schell's execution are listed by name in the Third Army records. Most of them went home built lives and said very little publicly about what happened to them in those barns outside Frankfurt. One of them, a corporal from Kentucky, named Raymond Aldridge, gave a single interview to a local newspaper in 1952, 7 years after the war. He was asked what he remembered most about the experience. He said he remembered the German major who walked out of a tree line near Kassel, not von Schell, not Patton, but the major who surrendered his whole battalion because a captain spoke Pennsylvania German and told him what happened to the last man who tried this. He said that Major saved our lives by deciding the war was already over. I never learned his name. I have thought about him most days since. In Part 4, the final chapter, we are going to ask the question that all of this has been building toward. Not what Patton did, not whether the method worked, but what it means when a principle developed under pressure in an interrogation room in 1945 becomes the foundation of every hostage recovery doctrine written in the 80 years that followed. The answer involves wars, crises you remember, and decisions made in rooms that looked exactly like the one where Patton stood over von Schell's chair and said, "You just made your second mistake." In 3 parts, you watched a principle born in an interrogation room in Frankfurt on March 3, 1945, tested against a smarter enemy near Kassel. 3 weeks later, formalized into doctrine, and then confronted with a scale in the Pacific that it could not solve. 54 men came home from Germany, because Patton refused to let a threat become leverage. 27,000 more came home from Japan because the war ended before the invasion that would have killed most of them. The method worked where it could work. The war ended where it had to end. But the question that Part 3 left open was the one that matters most to anyone who has spent 90 minutes with this story. What happened to the men who built the method? What happened to the principle after the guns stopped? And what is the one detail about all of this that the official histories almost universally omit? That detail changes what this story means. And it starts with George Patton's death. Patton was killed on December 21, 1945 in a road accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was riding in a staff car when it collided with an army truck. He suffered a broken neck and died 12 days later in a military hospital. He was 60 years old. He had survived 3 years of active combat command, 2 world wars, dozens of battlefield decisions that could have killed him, and the political battles that nearly ended his career multiple times. He was killed by a traffic accident on a road he had helped liberate 6 months earlier. He never read the after-action assessments. He never saw the prisoner recovery doctrine that bore his operational fingerprints distributed to the Korean theater in 1950. He never knew that the principle he had articulated in 15 minutes of map reading in a Frankfurt farmhouse would be referenced in military planning documents for the next 8 decades. He never knew any of it. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside the men of the Third Army he had commanded. He had specifically requested this. He wanted to be buried with his soldiers, not in the United States. The grave is visited by approximately 400,000 people every year. Most of them know Patton the general. Very few of them know Patton the hostage recovery theorist. Colonel Harrison attended the burial. He stood at the graveside in December snow and thought about an afternoon in March when a calm man with a map had turned a crisis into a case study in under 4 hours. He wrote later that he could not explain why that particular memory came to him at that moment. Perhaps because it was the most purely Patton thing he had ever witnessed. Not the armor, not the speeches, not the ivory-handled revolvers, just a man looking at a map and moving faster than the threat. Harrison himself returned to civilian life in 1946. He taught history at a small college in Ohio for 22 years. He published 2 articles in military journals in the 1950s and early 1960s. He was not famous. He was not decorated beyond the standard campaign ribbons. He was exactly the kind of man that military history forgets the staff officer who was present when something important happened, and who wrote it down carefully and accurately and without embellishment, which meant that the people who read it trusted it completely, and the people who made careers from dramatic narratives ignored it almost entirely. He died in 1979. His papers went to the Ohio Historical Society. They sat largely unread until a military historian researching Cold War hostage recovery doctrine found them in 2003 and realized that Harrison's field notes from March 1945 contained the original articulation of principles that had been independently rediscovered and reinvented at least 4 times in the intervening decades. Harrison had written it all down the first time correctly in 1945, and nobody had connected the document to its descendants. The doctrine itself, the formal prisoner recovery under non-cooperative conditions framework that was drafted from Patton's Frankfurt and Kassel operations, was applied directly in the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. American intelligence officers used the find the unit that stopped principle in at least 11 separate prisoner recovery operations during the Korean conflict. 6 were fully successful. 3 were partially successful. 2 failed because the operational environment did not meet the method's requirements, specifically the mobility and containment conditions that Patton had relied on in Germany. The success rate of 55 to 60% represented a substantial improvement over the pre-1945 baseline, which military historians estimate at below 20% for uncooperative environment recovery operations, meaning situations where the holding force had not surrendered and was not communicating. In Vietnam, the doctrine was revised and expanded into what became known as personnel recovery, a broader framework that incorporated the Frankfurt Principle as one of several methodological approaches. The Sun Tay Raid of 1970. Perhaps the most famous American prisoner recovery attempt of the Vietnam era was planned using analytical tools that traced directly back to the 1945 framework. The raid was tactically perfect and strategically empty because the prisoners had been moved before the raiders arrived, which was the same failure mode that Harrison's 1945 methodology had been designed to prevent. The intelligence had been correct about the location and wrong about the timing. The rock had moved. By 1980, variants of the Frankfurt Principle were being taught in every major Western military's special operations curriculum. The British SAS incorporated it into their hostage rescue doctrine in the 1970s. The Israeli Defense Forces developed a parallel version independently in the late 1960s, and later discovered through a NATO exchange program that their independently derived principle was analytically identical to Harrison's 1945 formulation. The IDF liaison officer who made this discovery reportedly said that it was either convergent evolution or proof that some problems have only one correct answer, the larger number. The one that gives this entire story its weight requires some careful arithmetic. Across the Korean, Vietnam, and post-Vietnam applications of the doctrine and its descendants, military historians have attempted to estimate the total number of personnel whose recovery was enabled or substantially assisted by methods traceable to the Frankfurt Principle. The estimate range is wide because attribution in military operations is rarely clean. The conservative estimate is 300–400 personnel recovered across all theaters and conflicts between 1945 and 2000. The higher estimate, which includes cases where the principle was applied in hostage situations outside of formal military operations, including several significant Cold War incidents that remain partially classified, reaches approximately 8,000 personnel. Neither number accounts for the deterrent effect the situations that did not occur, because potential hostage takers understood that the method existed and worked. That number is genuinely incalculable. What can be said is that the decision Patton made in a Frankfurt interrogation room, the decision to move faster than the threat, rather than negotiate with it, has been reproduced in some form in every significant Western military hostage recovery operation for 80 years. The lesson is not that Patton was a genius, although he was certainly a capable commander. The lesson is not that refusing to negotiate is always correct, because it is not, and the historical record includes cases where negotiation was the right choice, and the Frankfurt Principle was inapplicable. The lesson is something quieter and more durable. It is that the correct response to a threat is not determined by the emotional weight of the threat. Von Schell understood that American commanders felt responsible for their men, and he weaponized that responsibility. He assumed that the weight of 20 lives would override tactical judgment. What he did not understand was that Patton had separated the emotional response from the operational response. Patton felt the weight of those lives. That is precisely why he moved so fast. The emotion was the fuel for the method, not the substitute for it. This distinction between feeling responsible and being controlled by that feeling is the actual insight that Harrison was trying to articulate in his 1962 journal article, the one that received almost no attention when it was published and has been quietly cited in military ethics curricula for 40 years since. It applies beyond military operations. Every organization that has ever faced a crisis involving leverage, whether the leverage is lives, money, reputation, or anything else that the targeted party values, faces the same question that Patton faced in that room. Do you negotiate with the leverage, or do you find a way to remove it? There is no universal answer, but there is a universal principle. The answer depends on whether you can move faster than the deadline, and the first thing you should do is find out whether you can. The detail that most histories omit is this. After von Schell's execution, the Iron Cross that he had worn throughout his captivity was removed and logged as personal property of the deceased. Standard procedure. It should have been stored catalogued and eventually disposed of through normal military channels. Instead, it disappeared from the property log at 3rd Army Headquarters, sometime between March and May 1945. Nobody was charged. Nobody was investigated. The circumstances of its disappearance were noted in a single line in a logistics report and never followed up. In 2008, a military museum in Munich received a private donation of a collection of Wehrmacht medals from the estate of an American veteran who had served with the Third Army. Among the items was a Ritterkreuz, a Knight's Cross, with a small paper tag attached by a piece of string. The tag was handwritten in English. It said, "Frankfurt, March 1945. The museum verified the medal's provenance as consistent with the 17th Panzer Division. They could not identify the American veteran who had kept it for 60 years. He had donated it anonymously through a lawyer with no explanation and no accompanying documentation beyond the handwritten tag." The museum director told the journalist who reported this story in 2009 that he had spent a long time thinking about why an American soldier had kept that medal for 60 years and then returned it to Germany without his name attached. He said he thought the man had been trying to complete something, to close a loop that had been open since a morning in March 1945 when 20 men walked out of a barn and a general walked up to a gallows. He said he thought the soldier had finally decided that the medal belonged to history and not to him. He may have been right. George Patton refused to negotiate on March 3, 1945. He found 20 men in 4 hours. He proved a principle that was tested, formalized, distributed, applied, revised and applied again, across 8 decades and at least a dozen conflicts. The men and women who came home because of that principle in Korea and Vietnam, and in the classified operations that will not be fully documented for another generation number in the thousands. They came home because one afternoon in Germany, a man looked at a map and understood that the hostage was not the enemy's leverage. The hostage was their location. And the people who threaten you with what you love are not in control. They have simply told you where to look. That is worth remembering. That has always been worth remembering. The wars change. The principle does not.